Greetings. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. I'm Lexi Eve, and we're plowing straight on ahead with chapter 28, Need to Define God, Self, etc. So before we begin, this chapter is mostly about a letter that Mackie had written to Crowley, and he highlights two terms, higher self and God within us. So I'll have those on the screen the duration of this video, because as I go over certain words you might forget. What were the phrases? So that being said, we're going to be analyzing those 5 words from these two terms. So, quote, Chorosaurus, artless remark. Oh, you, well, I suppose it's a gift. To stir hell to its most abysmal horror with one small remark slipped in at the end. Scorpion. Higher self, God within us. End quote. Apparently, at the end of her last letter to Crowley, Mackie had written a statement with hyperbolic platitudes, I guess you could call it, and Crowley thought this was completely unintentional enough a use of language for him to make his response all about breaking down these 5 words and to make a point of using words strategically with intention and really understanding their definitions, connotations, etymology. What are the actual words you're using and how are you communicating that to somebody else, and do they understand what you're actually saying? So Crowley makes the point that such phrases as higher self are so overused by those who misunderstand the terms that they ultimately lose their true meaning. Now, right after saying that, I'm going to make a point here because this book published these letters before Crowley died, so early 1940s, 42, 43, 44, whatever. This will not be the last time. It is the first time so far going through the text, but he uses some really messed up terminology, straight up derogatory phrases. So here at the end of these first opening paragraphs, he uses the N-word. And like I said, that's not going to be the last time in this book, so I want to start addressing this now. Worse, he does it to indicate the derogatory meaning for a black person, not just in the Webster's dictionary definition of where the word originally meant before it was put on African Americans or other slaves of color. And he does this simply to create a shock in the reader. So this book itself often explains that the term, though offensive, and these are in the footnotes, that though offensive was still used with impunity in his days, but regardless, he's rotten for it. He knew what he was doing, and he owns it. Here in this letter, I then have the trouble seeing the Master Therion at times, but rather the English language wordsmith Alistair at work in this writing. The Magus was great. The man, not so much at times. Not a horrible person by any means, but did shitty things like this often enough. So it becomes a matter of, well, is he right about occult stuff? Often, yes. He was studied and practiced. Was he a good person? In general, I believe so, but not always. He was capable of being quite shitty. And it's unfortunate. Turns a lot of people off. And, well, his work has to either speak for itself. And I think that's one of the things with Crowley. You have to learn to look past the person, past the flaws, and if you can do that, you could kind of see what the limit is behind that and just get past the surface level of who Crowley was as a person, because he had tendencies that were really messed up. So he was prey, obviously, to his mental processes, and he never grew past those on the human level. So I would not have felt okay moving past that opening paragraph without at least mentioning it. So from here on, we're going to move into the chapter, and he's going to begin giving definitions of those 5 words that I mentioned earlier. Quote, number 1, higher. Here we fall straight into the arms of Freud. Why higher? Because in a scrap it is easier to strangle him if you are on top. When very young children watch their parents in actu coitus, a circumstance exceedingly usual almost anywhere outside of England, And even here, where house room is restricted, the infant supposes that his mother, upon whom he depends entirely for nourishment, is being attacked by the intrusive stranger whom they want him to address as dad. From this seed springs an over-under complex, giving rise later on, in certain cases, to whole legions of neuroses. Now then, make it a little clearer, please, just what you mean by higher, end quote. So, starts off funny, but we're actually going to explain the term higher in a second. But in what he just wrote, I think it's interesting. We still use the phrases top and bottom today to indicate sexual positions in a relationship. So he does have a point there that higher self, is this the self that is penetrating the lower self? Which is funny, but though there's always dick jokes with Crowley, there's often something deeper there. So it's like, yeah, there actually is the chemical or mystical marriage of the magician with the holy guardian angel, and there is some sexual internal alchemy that takes place there. But was that how she was using the term higher in regards to higher self? So the phrase higher self on its own has no context, save for the connotations we have assigned to it. Say that phrase to 100 people from different walks of life, and each will have their own interpretation. Higher literally means above, on top of, taller than, etc. Depending on context, it can refer to the head or heart, which is higher than the feet, the upper portion of the body. The head is the higher part of self. So if you have to be very particular with what words you're using when you're describing something occult or spiritual or magical. Quote, Skeet, who had a dictionary, Skeet seems to connect it with hills, swellings, boils, and maternal breast. Is that reason enough for us to connect it with the idea of advantage or superiority merely translates it into Latin? Or is it worth, or no, it's really too difficult. Of course, sometimes it has a bad meaning, as of temperature and fever, but nearly always it implies a condition preferable to low, end quote. But what does this phrase commonly mean when spoken by Hermetic practitioners? Yes, temperature could be higher or lower. There's so many different connotations to higher. Quote, applied to the self, it becomes sort of a trade name. Nobody tells me if he means Ku, or Ba, or Kabs, or Ut of the Upanishads, or the Agoides of the Neoplatonists, or Adonai of Bulwer Lytton, or here we are with all those thrice accursed alternatives. There is cannot be any specific meaning unless we start with a sound skeleton of ontogenic theory, a well-mapped hierarchy of the cosmos, and define the term anew, end quote. So ontogenic is the study of ontogeny, which is the study of history of any individual orgasm from conception to adulthood. So through its life cycle from when it first hits whatever the womb or egg or whatever, depending on the species. So it's, in this case, Crowley means the ontogenic higher. So what was its origins? Crowley means we cannot understand the term higher self unless we were to research the origin and evolution of the word. So the Egyptians had a classification of the soul, Ku, Kabs, Ka, and Ba, all meaning spirit, but distinct parts of the soul from lowest to highest, or more earthly to most divine or source-like. The Kabbalah has a 5-part map of the soul with the Nefesh, the Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yechaida. Higher self may mean any of these things, and yet be thoroughly aloof, not referring to anyone in particular. Quote, then why use it? To do so can only cause confusion unless the context helps us to clarify the image. When I first set myself to put a name to my mission, the contemplation carried me halfway across southwest China. I considered these alternatives. I thought to cut the Gordian knot and call it by Abramelon's title, Holy Guardian Angel, because, I mused, that will be as intelligible to the villagers of Pupang as to the most learned pundits. Moreover, the implied theory was so crude that no one need be bound by it. End quote. All this to say, Choose your words carefully and be more specific. It not only helps the listener understand what you mean, but causes you to think and be more clear. If you cannot be more clear, then you should reevaluate whether you understand what you are talking about or not. So we skip the word self, higher self, as in the term that she used. And Crowley states that there's an entire chapter 42 of Magick Without Tears that covers the term self. Thus, we move on to quote 2, within. If you don't mind, we'll tackle this now while higher is fresh in our minds, for it is also a preposition. First, you want to go up, then you want to go in. Why? As higher gave the idea of aggression, of conquest, within usually implies safety. Always we get back to that stage of history when the social unit based on the family was little less than condition number 1 of survival. The house, the cattle, the fortified camp, the city walls. The gens, not sure what that means, the gens, but the gens, the clan, the tribe, the patria. To be outside means danger from cold, hunger, and thirst. Raiding parties, highway robbers, bears, wolves, and tigers. To go out was to take a risk, and your labors and courage being assets to your kinsmen, you were also a bad man, in fact, a bounder or outsider. Debauch is simply to go out of doors. St. John says, without are dogs and sorcerers and whoremongers and adulterers and idolaters and so on. End quote. So, taking this in tow with the theme of using platitudes, which I'm just coining it, the statement God within is rather absurd for several reasons. Most importantly, because it differentiates this God, which is supposed to be one and the same, omnipotent, omnipresent, and all the other omnis. So if it's a God within, then it's different than the God without by virtue of definition there. Quote, we of Thelema challenge all this briskly. The word of sin is restriction. Our formula, roughly speaking, is to go out and grab what we want. We do this so thoroughly that we grow thereby, extending our conception of I by including each new accretion instead of remaining a closely delineated self, proud of possessing other things, as do the Black brothers. End quote. So remember, back in the day when you had to fit inside this box, you needed to be within this community. Now we embrace our individuality of will. So let's unpack this. While an enlightened Thelemite who understands their true will may choose to be in a community or sheltered or otherwise cloistered from the world in retreat, they do so by will, and not by fear or pressure from their community to conform to a certain way of life. There is no box to fit into as a Thelemite. You are either free to do what you need to do, or you are not. That's it. If you decide not to pursue your will, primarily, this is usually because of fear, you have succumbed to the ego in the sense of I. The person doing their true will is expanding their sense of self, absorbing all new experiences, and thus assimilating into the whole, not remaining a fractured shard from it, cloistered off from the rest. Quote, we are wholehearted extroverts. The penalty of restricting oneself is anything from neurosis to downright lunacy, in particular melancholia, end quote. So, by definition, by today's standards, here I disagree with Crowley about all Thelemites being extroverts. Be yourself, period. People are vastly different. He may be using the word extrovert simply as outgoing and able to seek experience, to expand their circle, and to do their will. But by today's usage of extrovert and introvert, they are innate personality traits codified in our genetics and innate brain wiring. Meaning, as long as one isn't trying to be other than they are in truth, then they are essentially manifesting their true nature. The only other condition of Thelema being to do your will. Understand your nature and do your will. It's nobody's place to say what anyone else is or should be, so that's fine. He does say some stuff about restriction. I agree with all of that. But, restricting oneself can cause a whole series of insecurities and crazy neurosis, lunacy, melancholy, which is depression, anxiety, fear, all of those things. So don't restrict yourself. Just be true to yourself and don't let anybody tell you who you are. Figure that out. Quote, You ask whether these remarks do not conflict with my repeated definition of initiation as the way in. Not at all. The inmost is identical with the all. As you travel inward, you become able to perceive all the layers which surround the self from within, thus enlarging the scope of your vision of the universe. When the entire system of the universe is conterminous with your comprehension, inward and outward become identical. End quote. Or if you checked out my episode on the Emerald Tablet, it's the same thing as saying, as above, so below. Here we move on to the term God. Quote, "This is really too bad of you. Of all the hopeless, mangled words in the language, you settle with unerring sadism on the most brutally butchered." End quote. And Bill Heydrich has a footnote about this. Quote, "Shipley's Dictionary of Word Origins sneaks the following in under the word goodbye. God, goth, guth may be traced to Aryan gut, God, from guto, to implore, as in God is the one to whom we pray. God might also be a contraction of Odin as ode. Have the English-speaking Christians been praying to Asir all this time?" End quote. More than anything, I think that's funny. I don't think that the ode or odic force has any connection to the term God. I don't even think really the term good connects to the word God. Kind of a stretch there. Could be to implore, as in people, treat God as like this wishing well for prayers, but so there could be something to that, but look it up online. Check the etymology of the word God. It'd be interesting. There's a practice, could say I mandated you to. Quote, "The best I can do for you is the Russian word for God, bog, connected probably through the Lithuanian with the Welsh bach, a spectre or hobgoblin. Boogie, too. Not very inspiring, is it, to replace the old hundredth by hush, 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 here comes the boogeyman. Or is it?" End quote. So as an aside, this is something I found out a few years back when I was studying Slavic paganism. So in Lithuanian, Velnias, known today in Slavic revival groups as Velez, is the god of magic and the underworld. He was worshipped as a major deity and a rival of the sky god Perkunas, or Perun, who had his own faction of priests and worshippers. And even though this one religion had its own factions, this community still worked within it. It's not like the people who were following Perunkas and Velnias, they weren't necessarily fighting each other. They were part of the same community. Just they worshiped the sky god, they worshiped the underground god, as far as we know through historical documentation. But after the Christianization of Eastern Europe, Velnias, he was a horned god. He became synonymous with the evil trickster, and they made their word for the devil Velnias. Also, the root vele in Lithuanian is the word for spirit or fae. So you can see how this highly revered deity, his name literally has the root for spirit. And eventually became the devil. So words do influence other words as cultures and religious ideologies change. It's just an aside. To continue, quote, "Enough of this fooling. Out, trusty rapier, and home to the stone heart of the audacious woman that wrote God within us. I know you thought you knew more or less what you meant when you wrote it, but surely that was a mere slip. An instant's thought would have warned you that the word wouldn't stand even the most superficial analysis. You meant something which seems to me the most perfect symbol of all that I love, worship, admire. All that class of verb." End quote. So there are a rather lot of uneducated people out there, and often someone asks me what the symbols I wear or have tattooed mean. And I'm the type, I don't care. So in explaining Delima to such, in terms these common folk can understand, I inevitably rely on Kabbalah and often employ the term God just so they could follow along, though I make it clear that this is the source of all present, is nothing, and God does not exist. There is no personification. There is just this, and I'll flourish my hand at the world around us for them to gaze wonderingly, then further explaining that any deities a person worships are also a manifestation of that same nothingness. Usually going into 0 equals 2 is too complex for a layman, so it's generally useless unless they are really, really interested and have some religious instruction in their past history. But so I do use the term, but I use it knowing that this has no meaning whatsoever. Crowley continues about the word God, quote, "But nobody else will have the same set of qualities in his private museum. You have, as everyone has always done, made another God in your own image. Then the Vedantists define God as having neither quality nor quantity, and some yogis have a practice of setting up images to knock them down at once with, not that, not that. And the Buddhist won't admit any God at all in anything at all, like the sense in which you use the word. What's worse, whatever you may mean by God conveys no idea to me. I can only guess by the light of my exceedingly small knowledge of you and your general habits of thought and action. Then what sense was there in chucking it at my head? Half a brick would have served you better," end quote. So that's actually the thing right there. Everyone is limited by what they know and have experienced. And any term so personal to a person can only be understood by them alone, which then leads to thorough misunderstandings of communication, which no wonder we've had so many holy wars. So the holy guardian angel is the personal intermediary between the magician and the divine, thus is the most intimate experience and really nobody else's business. Crowley here wraps up the word God, quote, "You think you can explain to me viva voce, perhaps? Don't you dare try. Whatever you said I should prove to be nonsense philosophically and in a dozen other ways. And the county council ambulance would bundle you off in your battered and bewildered debris to the bug house, as is so etymologically indicated. Do see it simply. The word must in any event connote ideas of neshama, not of ruach. But you use the word all the time. Yes, I do, and rely on the context to crystallize this most fluid or gaseous of expressions," end quote. So from here, we're almost done. He's going to mention the word us, and then I'll just give a closing remark after that. Quote, "Why us? There is an anecdote of Lao Tse. The old one was surrounded, as usual, by a galaxy of adoring disciples, and they were trying to get him to show them where the Tao was to be found. It was in the sun and moon, he admitted. It was in the Son of Heaven and in the superior man. Not George Nathaniel Curzon, however." That's in parentheses, end quote. So I was going to take this out, but I think it's always funny when someone does this in an occult or spiritual text. The last time on this channel was in the OTO's 10th degree homunculus papers about, there was a mention of Dan Quayle, who was a former vice president, conservative, and whether Dan Quayle was an alchemical accident or the result of exposure to toxic waste. Here, George Curzon was a conservative in England politics and was Lord President of the English Council and Viceroy to India. So he was a very well-to-do person. So I just think it's funny when someone punches a conservative like so. It's kind of refreshing. But we were talking about Lao Tzu's students wondering where the Tao can be found. Quote, "It was in the blossoms of springtime and in the chilling winds that swept over from Siberia, and in the wild geese that it bore southward when their instinct bade them. In short, the catalogue began to look as if it were going to extend indefinitely, and an impatient disciple, pointing to certain traces left by a mule in its recent passage, asked, 'And is that the Tao also in that?' The master nodded and echoed, 'Also in that.' Well then, what becomes of this privileged us? We are obliged to extend it to include everything. Then, as we have just seen, God also is unfettered by definitions. Net result, God within us means precisely nothing at all." End quote. So this is what I love about the Lima Taoism and the Agora of India. They each make it clear that the infinite is in all things, stretched beyond the capabilities of the rational mind to grasp, or let's say that It is here, split into duality, and these qualities are constantly canceling each other out. Thus, it cannot be seen, yet it exists everywhere. However you want to say that, neither does justice to the reality, but that's as close as I can get. So I love systems that incorporate that idea that this thing you want to call God, whatever, is in everything, so you can't exclude it from anything. Now, this next bit is very important. People can twist anything they want to try to make a loophole when it comes to any subject, but especially occultism and discipline, stuff like that. And usually to justify what they are doing, whether that be the wrong thing for themselves, self-destructive, or just out of laziness. They don't want to go through the full process. So listen to this bit carefully. Quote, "Bind nothing. Let there be no difference made among you between any one thing and any other thing, for thereby there cometh hurt. But whoso availeth in this, let him be the chief of all. I implore you not to point out that, this being the case, words like hurt and chief cannot possibly mean anything. The fact is that if we are to get on peaceably in the club, we have to know when to take any given expression in a Pickwinian sense. In the Ruach, all the laws of logic apply. They don't in the Neshama. The real meaning of the passage is simple enough. If you understand that it refers to a specific result of initiation, you have to be able to reckon up the universe as a whole and in every part, and to get rid of all its false or partial realities by discarding everything but the one reality, which is the sole truth in and of illusion." End quote. And in closing, Crowley gives one final chastisement that though such whimsy words appear harmless when communicating occult science, essentially they are not harmless, and that should one want to try to communicate their experiences after they have undergone training and rigorous practices, they will find the impotence of words can never truly label that which is beyond the abyss. Quote, "Then despairing of your impotence, how glad you will be that you have trained not to let anyone fob you off with phrases." End quote. Love is the law. Love under will. I'll catch you on the next one.